I never liked winter. Something about the way the nights stretch longer and the biting cold seeps into your bones makes everything feel off. But after what happened to me last winter, I'll never look at snow the same way again. It started innocently enough. I'd rented a small cabin in the woods of northern Michigan for some peace and quiet. I'm a freelance writer, and deadlines were piling up. I thought some isolation would do me good, away from the distractions of the city. The cabin was picturesque, rustic, with a stone fireplace and perched at the edge of a dense forest. It looked like something out of a holiday postcard. The first 2 days were uneventful. The snow fell steadily, muffling the world in a heavy silence. I spent my time bundled in blankets, hammering away at my laptop by the fire. Occasionally, I'd step outside to gather firewood or breathe in the crisp, icy air. It felt like I was the only person for miles. I told myself that's what I wanted. On the third night, the strange things began. I was sitting by the fire, typing, when I heard something outside. A crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys, listening. The sound was faint but deliberate, moving slowly around the cabin. My first thought was that it was a deer or some other animal. But then I remembered. Animals don't walk in steady, measured steps. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing my breath. I scanned the area, the beam of light bouncing off the snow-covered trees. Nothing. The forest was dark, still, and impenetrable. Then I saw footprints. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin and back again. But here's the thing. There was only one set of prints. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't come from anywhere. It was as if they'd materialized from the forest itself. I shut the door and locked it, bolting it for good measure. I told myself it was probably some hiker who got lost and didn't want to disturb me. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning, I decided to check out the footprints in daylight. I bundled up and stepped outside, but the fresh snow had covered everything. No trace of the prints remained. I shook it off and went about my day, trying to focus on work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, it happened again. The footsteps came back, circling the cabin. This time, they were accompanied by a faint tapping on the windows. I didn't dare look. I just sat in the middle of the room, clutching a fire poker, praying for morning. The sound eventually stopped, but the damage was done. Sleep was impossible. The next day, I decided to leave. I didn't care about the deposit or the work I'd promised to finish. Something was wrong with that place. As I packed my bags, I glanced out the window and froze. There, on the edge of the forest, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. It didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching. I shut the curtains and tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but I knew better. I rushed to throw my belongings into my car and start the engine, desperate to leave. But as I backed out of the driveway, my car suddenly stalled. The cabin was on a remote road, surrounded by nothing but trees and snow. Cell service was spotty at best, and calling for help wasn't an option. I tried the engine again. Nothing. I was stranded. That night was the worst. The footsteps returned, but this time they didn't stop at the windows. They moved to the door. The doorknob rattled, softly at first, then harder, as if someone or something was testing it. I grabbed the fire poker again and stood in the corner, trembling. And then I heard it, a voice. Low, guttural, and barely audible. It called my name. How it knew my name, I have no idea. But hearing it spoken in that horrible, rasping tone nearly broke me. I wanted to scream, but I was too scared to make a sound. I just stood there, paralyzed, as the voice grew louder, more insistent. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence was worse. I stayed awake all night, watching the door, waiting for the next attack. But nothing came. When dawn finally broke, I bolted for the nearest road, abandoning my car and most of my belongings. I walked for hours through the snow until I found a ranger station. The ranger listened to my story with a skeptical expression, but he agreed to drive me back to the cabin to retrieve my things. When we arrived, the cabin looked off. The windows were broken, the door hung ajar, and claw marks, long, deep, and inhuman, scarred the wooden frame. The ranger turned pale but said nothing. I gathered what I could and left, never looking back. I don't know what I encountered in those woods. Maybe it was a spirit, a creature, or something else entirely. All I know is that it wanted me, and I came dangerously close to letting it in. I'll never go back to that cabin. And every time winter rolls around, I find myself watching the shadows a little more closely. Sometimes late at night, I think I can still hear it calling my name.
Story number 2.
It happened 3 years ago, in the dead of winter. I was driving through rural Pennsylvania, heading home for the holidays. The roads were slick with ice, and a heavy snowstorm had rolled in earlier than forecasted. I was barely halfway into my 6-hour drive when my car skidded on a patch of black ice and landed nose first into a snowbank. I wasn't hurt, but the car wouldn't budge. Worse, I had no cell signal. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with night falling fast. The only sign of civilization was a dimly lit building a short walk down the road. A faded wooden sign outside read, Timmins Lodge, vacancy. I didn't have much choice. Pulling my coat tightly around me, I trudged through the snow to the lodge. It looked ancient, its wooden facade warped and weathered by time. The lights flickered in the windows, giving the place an eerie, almost haunted look, but I figured it was better than freezing to death in my car. Inside, the lodge smelled faintly of damp wood and mothballs. An elderly man with a hunched back stood behind the counter, his sunken eyes tracking me as I walked in. "Got caught in the storm, did ya?" he rasped, his voice thick with a local accent. I nodded and explained my situation. He handed me a key without asking too many questions. Room 5, end of the hall. Breakfast's at 6. The room was small but clean, with a single bed and an old radiator clanking away in the corner. I was grateful for the warmth and the chance to rest. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since I'd arrived. The lodge was too quiet. Not a single other guest was in sight, and the only sound was the howl of the wind outside. As I lay in bed trying to drift off, I heard it, a soft scratching noise, like nails dragging across wood. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, coming from the direction of the closet. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the steady, rhythmic scratching. Summoning my courage, I got out of bed and crept toward the closet. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I yanked it open and found nothing. Just an empty closet with a single wire hanger swaying gently. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me. But as I climbed back into bed, I noticed something chilling. The scratches weren't coming from the closet anymore. They were coming from under the bed. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate scratching, as if someone or something was clawing at the wooden floor beneath me. Every instinct screamed at me not to look, but I couldn't help myself. I leaned over the edge of the bed, heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw them, 2 glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Before I could scream, a hand, pale, bony, and impossibly long, shot out and grabbed my ankle. I scrambled back, kicking wildly, and the thing let out a guttural hiss that sent chills down my spine. I bolted for the door, flinging it open and racing down the hallway. The scratching sounds followed me, echoing off the walls, faster and louder with every step. When I reached the lobby, the old man was gone. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in from the storm outside. I didn't stop to question it. I ran out into the night, not caring about the cold or the snow. Somehow, I made it back to the road. Miraculously, a passing trucker spotted me and pulled over. He took one look at my pale, trembling face and didn't ask questions, just helped me into his cab and drove me to the nearest town. When I tried to explain what had happened, he looked at me like I was crazy. "Timmins Lodge," he said, shaking his head. "That place burned down 20 years ago. Nobody's been there since." I didn't believe him at first, but when I went back the next day with the local sheriff, there was nothing there but the charred remains of a building. No lights, no old man, no room 5. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But every time I hear the sound of scratching, even from something as innocent as a tree branch against a window, I can feel those eyes watching me again.
Story number 3.
It was the winter of 2019, and I had just moved to a small town in Minnesota for a job. I didn't know anyone yet, and the idea of spending the holidays alone didn't sit well with me. A coworker, Todd, invited me to a little gathering at his family's hunting cabin deep in the woods. He promised me good company, a warm fire, and enough spiked cider to last the night. The drive to the cabin was treacherous. Snow piled high on either side of the narrow road, and the trees loomed like sentinels in the darkness. By the time I arrived, I was half convinced I'd made a mistake. The cabin wasn't much to look at, just a squat, weather-beaten structure with a smoking chimney. But the warm light spilling out of the windows and the sound of laughter inside made me feel welcome. There were 6 of us: Todd, his sister Emily, her boyfriend Derek, 2 old friends of theirs, and me. The night started well. We drank, swapped stories, and laughed until our faces hurt. But as the hours stretched on, the mood shifted. It started with a story Emily told, a local legend about the Wendigo. According to her, these woods were its hunting grounds. She described it in detail: tall, skeletal, with antlers like a deer and eyes that glowed in the dark. It was a creature of endless hunger, she said, cursed to wander the forests, devouring anyone foolish enough to cross its path. We laughed it off, of course, but there was something in her tone that made me uneasy. I told myself it was just the isolation and the alcohol playing tricks on my nerves. Around midnight, we ran out of firewood. Todd and Derek volunteered to fetch more from the woodpile outside. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The 2 of them still hadn't come back. Maybe they're messing with us, Emily said, though she didn't sound convinced. She and one of her friends, Liz, decided to check on them. That left me and the last guy, Brian, sitting in awkward silence by the fire. More time passed. The snowstorm outside had picked up, howling against the windows. Brian joked that Todd and the others had probably bailed, leaving us to fend for ourselves. I didn't laugh. Then we heard it, a sharp knock at the door. Brian got up to answer it, but when he opened the door, there was no one there. Just a blast of icy wind and a strange set of tracks in the snow leading away from the cabin. They weren't human. They were long and clawed, like something had dragged itself through the snow on all fours. Probably a bear, Brian said, though his voice shook. We locked the door and sat back down, both of us trying to act like we weren't terrified. Then came the second knock, this time from the window. My heart stopped. Brian grabbed the poker from the fireplace and inched toward the sound. When he pulled back the curtain, all the blood drained from his face. It's Todd, he stammered, backing away. I rushed to the window. Sure enough, Todd was standing there in the snow, but something was wrong. His face was pale, his lips blue, and his eyes, oh God, his eyes were wide and unblinking. He was shivering violently, his breath fogging up the glass. We opened the window to let him in, but the moment the glass slid up, Todd let out a sound I can only describe as a scream mixed with a growl. It was primal, inhuman. He bolted into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. Brian wanted to go after him, but I stopped him. "Something's not right," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. Then we heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and circling the cabin. They didn't sound like Todd. They sounded bigger. Brian and I huddled by the fire, gripping the poker and a hunting knife we'd found in a drawer. The footsteps stopped and the cabin fell deathly silent. And then came the voice. It was Todd's voice, calling out from the woods. "Help me. Please." The words were distorted, stretched as if someone or something was mimicking him. Brian stood up, moving toward the door, but I grabbed his arm. "That's not him," I hissed. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I'm hurt." It was followed by another knock at the door. Louder, more insistent. We didn't answer. We didn't move. The thing outside began pounding on the door, the force rattling the cabin. The walls shook, and the air filled with a high-pitched whine, like the sound of 1,000 insects buzzing at once. And then it stopped. We stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep. When the first light of morning seeped through the windows, we dared to venture outside. There was no sign of Todd, Derek, Emily, or Liz. Just those strange clawed tracks leading into the woods, and nothing else. The police didn't believe us. They said the others must have gotten lost in the storm, but I know what I saw, or rather, what I heard. I've never been back to those woods, and every winter, when the nights grow long and the snow piles high, I hear that voice in my dreams calling to me from the darkness. "Help me, please."
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me and my girlfriend, Sarah. We had rented a remote cabin in the Colorado Rockies, hoping for some quality time away from work and the chaos of city life. The cabin was gorgeous, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and a stunning view of the snow-covered mountains. It felt like the perfect winter escape. The first night was peaceful. We cooked dinner, played board games by the fire, and watched the snow falling gently outside. But that calm didn't last. On the second day, the storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and making the entire cabin creak. We shrugged it off, thinking it was just the harsh weather. But as the hours dragged on, strange things began to happen. It started with the footprints. I'd gone outside to gather more firewood and noticed them. Large, deep impressions in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to our cabin. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear, but the shape was all wrong. They were long and narrow, with claw-like marks at the tips, and they seemed to be spaced too far apart, as if whatever made them was unnaturally tall. When I showed Sarah, she tried to brush it off. Maybe it's just an animal, or maybe it's from the previous renters. But the storm had only started that morning. The snow would have covered anything older. That night, we were sitting by the fire when we heard it, a faint knocking sound. It wasn't coming from the door, but from the side of the cabin. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone or something was tapping to get our attention. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The cold hit me like a slap, and the wind nearly blew the light out of my hand. I shone the beam around the porch and saw nothing. But then I noticed them again, the footprints. This time, they led up to the side of the cabin and circled back into the woods. I shut the door and bolted it, my heart racing. Sarah tried to calm me down, but I could tell she was just as scared. We stayed up late, jumping at every little sound the storm made. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. I bolted upright, heart pounding. Sarah was still asleep beside me. I shook her awake, whispering frantically, "Someone's in the house." We crept downstairs, clutching the fire poker and a knife from the kitchen. The front door was wide open, snow blowing inside and leaving a trail of wet footprints across the wooden floor. They weren't ours. We followed the prints, which led into the living room, and then stopped. There was no sign of anyone. No muddy tracks leading back outside, just a dead silence, as if the storm had paused to listen. Suddenly, Sarah gasped. She pointed to the window. There, etched into the frost on the glass, was a single word: leave. We grabbed our coats and decided to drive to the nearest town, storm be damned. But when we stepped outside, our car was buried under several feet of snow, and the wind was so fierce we could barely see a few feet ahead. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing from the tree line. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, and my blood ran cold. Something was standing there, just at the edge of the forest. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a face that was more like a skull than anything human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. We bolted back inside, locking every door and window. The growling followed us, growing louder, circling the cabin. The walls began to shudder as if something massive was pressing against them. Then came the scratching. It started at the front door and moved along the walls, slow and deliberate, like claws dragging against the wood. Sarah was crying, clutching the knife so tightly her knuckles were white. I didn't know what to do. Calling for help was pointless. There was no signal this deep in the mountains. Just when we thought it couldn't get worse, the scratching stopped. The silence was suffocating. Then came a voice, low, distorted, and echoing, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. You were warned. The fire suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, huddled together, waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, the storm had passed. We wasted no time packing our bags and trekking through the snow to the main road. A passing plow driver found us and took us to the nearest town. When we returned with the authorities to retrieve our car, the cabin was gone. Not damaged, not burned, just gone, as if it had never been there. The only thing left was the footprints, leading from where the cabin had stood into the endless woods. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know it wanted us gone. And I know we were lucky to leave with our lives.
Story number 5.
It was a tradition in my family to spend Christmas at my grandparents' old farmhouse in northern Michigan. The place was nestled in a secluded valley surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. That year, a blizzard had blanketed the entire area in snow so deep it reached my knees. The isolation was supposed to make the holiday magical. Instead, it turned into the most horrifying experience of my life. I arrived with my sister Hannah a few days before Christmas. The farmhouse was the same as ever. Quaint, cozy, and steeped in the smell of wood smoke and baked goods. My grandparents greeted us warmly, and we spent the first night reminiscing, laughing, and watching the snow pile up outside. But something felt off. There were no neighbors for miles, yet I kept catching glimpses of movement in the woods from the corner of my eye. Shadows darting between the trees, too quick to be animals. My grandparents insisted it was nothing, just the wind stirring the branches. But Hannah and I weren't so sure. On the second night, things escalated. We were all sitting in the living room, enjoying the glow of the fireplace, when we heard it, a knock at the door. It was strange, given the storm outside and the remote location. My grandfather opened the door, but there was no one there, just snow swirling in the wind and a pair of footprints leading away from the porch. Probably some hiker lost in the storm, he muttered, shutting the door. They'll find their way back. But the prints weren't heading toward the road. They led into the woods. That night, I woke to a strange sound, whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too deliberate, too human. It sounded like voices coming from outside my window, low and rhythmic, as if they were chanting something. I peeked through the curtains and froze. There were figures standing in the snow, just beyond the tree line. Dozens of them, shrouded in shadow, their faces obscured by the falling snow. They stood perfectly still, staring at the house. My breath fogged up the glass, and when I wiped it away, the figures were gone. The next morning, I told my grandparents and Hannah what I'd seen. My grandmother went pale, but she didn't say a word. My grandfather brushed it off, saying I'd probably been dreaming. But Hannah had seen them too. That evening, the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. My grandfather opened the door, and again, there was no one there. Just the storm and more footprints leading away into the woods. We decided to board up the windows and doors, just to be safe. My grandfather stayed up late, sitting by the fire with his shotgun across his lap. Around midnight, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from all around the house, seeping through the walls. Then came the scratching. It started at the back door, a slow, deliberate scraping sound that sent chills down my spine. My grandfather shouted for us to stay put and went to investigate. We heard him yell, then the sound of glass shattering. We found him in the kitchen, pointing his shotgun at the broken window. Snow was blowing in, and there were fresh footprints in the powder on the floor. "Whatever it is," he said, his voice trembling, "it's not human." The rest of the night was a blur of terror. The whispers grew louder, turning into guttural growls. The scratching moved from window to window, as if something was circling the house looking for a way in. At one point, Hannah screamed. She said she'd seen a face pressed against the window, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch too wide. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. We ventured outside to find the yard covered in tracks, hundreds of them, all leading back into the forest. The snowstorm had eased, and we decided to leave. My grandparents insisted they'd stay, claiming the house was their home, and they weren't about to abandon it. As Hannah and I drove away, I looked back at the farmhouse one last time, and I saw them. The figures were back, standing in the woods watching us leave. One of them raised a hand as if to wave goodbye. I've never returned to that farmhouse. My grandparents moved out the following spring, saying the winters had become too harsh. They never spoke about that night, and neither do we. But sometimes when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear those whispers again.
Story number 6.
A few years ago, I took a job as a seasonal caretaker for a small lodge in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was isolated, miles from the nearest town, and shut down every winter due to the heavy snowfall. My job was to make sure the place didn't fall into disrepair during the off-season. It sounded like a dream job at first. 3 months of solitude, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered woods and peace and quiet. The owners assured me it would be easy. Just keep the pipes from freezing, check the generator, and make sure the place doesn't burn down, they said. The first week was uneventful. I spent most of my time reading, taking walks in the snow, and enjoying the silence. But by the second week, I started noticing strange things. It began with the snow. Every morning, I'd wake up to find tracks in the fresh powder outside the lodge. They were small, almost childlike, and they always started and stopped in the middle of the yard, with no sign of where they'd come from or where they went. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal, but the prints were too perfect. Tiny, bare feet, as if a child were walking around in the snow. By the third week, the noises started. Late at night, I'd hear faint laughter echoing through the lodge. It sounded like children playing, their giggles soft and eerie. I checked every room, but the place was always empty. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, but there was no one there. Just those tiny footprints in the layer of snow that had blown in through a cracked window. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself the isolation was playing tricks on me. But then I found the handprints. They were on the windows, smudged into the frost. Small, childlike hands, too high up to belong to anyone outside. That night, I barricaded myself in my room, too scared to sleep. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, and when I swear I could hear voices whispering just outside the door. You shouldn't be here. The whispers turned into banging on the walls, the door, the windows. It sounded like dozens of hands pounding, desperate to get in. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the job or the paycheck. I just wanted out. When I told the owners about what had happened, they looked at each other uneasily. "We should have warned you," one of them admitted. "Years ago, a group of kids got lost in a storm near the lodge. They froze to death before anyone could find them. People say their spirits still wander the area looking for warmth. I don't know if it's true, and I don't want to know. I've never been back to that lodge, and I can't even look at a snowy forest without feeling a chill crawl up my spine. Sometimes, though, when the wind howls outside, I think I hear it again. That faint, eerie laughter carried on the winter air."
Story number 7.
I'll never forget the winter of 2021. My friend Dave and I were on a road trip through rural Maine, heading to a ski resort up north. The drive took us deep into isolated territory, winding roads surrounded by thick forests on either side. The snowstorm that hit us halfway through was unexpected, a blinding whiteout that turned the trip into a nightmare. After hours of slow driving, the GPS led us onto a back road that didn't even seem plowed. Dave insisted we press on, convinced it was a shortcut, but soon the car got stuck in a snowbank. With no signal on our phones and night falling fast, we decided to hike back to a small house we'd passed about a mile back. It looked abandoned, but it was our only option. The house was old and decrepit, sagging under the weight of the snow. The windows were broken and the door hung slightly ajar. Still, it was shelter. Inside, the place was colder than outside. Dust blanketed every surface, and strange symbols were etched into the wooden walls. They looked like runes, or maybe old Nordic writing. I couldn't tell. The worst part was the smell. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger the deeper we went into the house. It was rancid, like something had died and been left to rot. We found an old fireplace in the main room and decided to make a fire. Dave went to gather wood from a pile outside while I explored the rest of the house. That's when I found the room. It was small, tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and inside was nothing but an old wooden chair. Ropes hung limply from its arms and legs, and deep scratches covered the floorboards around it, as if someone or something had been desperately trying to escape. A chill went through me, and I quickly shut the door. When I got back to the fireplace, Dave was standing there, staring at something in his hands. It was an old Polaroid photo he'd found in the pile of wood. "Look at this," he said, handing it to me. The photo showed a man sitting in the very chair I'd just seen. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. Behind him stood a shadowy figure, its features obscured, but its presence unmistakably menacing. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. But before we could gather our things, we heard it. A slow, deliberate creaking sound, like someone stepping on old floorboards. We froze, listening. The creaking came again, closer this time. "Hello?" Dave called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the howling wind outside and the sound of footsteps approaching. We grabbed the flashlight and turned it toward the hallway. The beam caught something moving, just a fleeting glimpse of a figure disappearing into the room with the chair. "What the hell was that?" Dave whispered, backing away. Suddenly, the fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. The smell of decay grew stronger, almost unbearable. And then we heard the whispering. It came from all around us, low and guttural, in a language I didn't recognize. The sound made my skin crawl, like it was burrowing into my brain. "Run," I whispered. We bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in front of us. Dave yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices that seemed to vibrate the very walls. I shone the flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw it. The shadowy figure from the photo was standing in the corner, watching us. Its form was humanoid, but twisted, as if its limbs had been broken and reset at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It took a step toward us. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then it spoke, its voice a low rasp that seemed to echo inside my head. "Leave now, or join me forever." The door burst open behind us, and we didn't hesitate. We ran into the snow, not stopping until we reached the road. Somehow the storm had eased, and a passing plow driver spotted us and took us into town. When we tried to go back for the car the next day, we couldn't find the house. The road we'd taken didn't even seem to exist anymore, as if it had been swallowed by the forest. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that house. All I know is that I can't look at an old Polaroid without feeling a wave of nausea, and every winter I avoid driving through the woods. Some things are better left behind in the snow.